Hello and welcome to my video about the top 10 facts about EOS that I learned while doing way more than 10 facts worth of research. And if you want to see the rest of the research and information that I did on EOS, that I gathered on EOS, then go ahead and check out my website, which is cryptkeepers.club. And go to the Crypt Keeper by Coin section. When you hover over that, there's a drop down menu of different cryptocurrencies that I've evaluated, one of which is EOS, which is why we're here. So the first fact or bit of information that I want to get out there about EOS is the fact that it is comparable to Ethereum in nature. Like whenever you're trying to evaluate a company or anything for that matter, it helps to have comps in the industry. And in this case, EOS is most akin. It's like comparing apples to apples. The closest apple is, and the one that it's compared to the most often in the crypto world, is Ethereum. And the reason for that is because just like Ethereum, EOS allows its users to program smart contracts and build decentralized applications on its network. That being said, what brings me to point number 2 is that if you are trying to compare apples to apples, Ethereum is doing way better, because as of the third quarter of this year of 2019, EOS only had 13 tokens built on its platform, and Ethereum had over 1,300 tokens built on its platform, one of which, ironically, is EOS. So again, trying to compare apples to apples, one's doing a lot better. One's a much more robust and healthy apple than the other. So EOS has a lot of catching up to do in terms of tokens that are built on its platform, but it does have a lot of applications that are being built on its platform, and again, more details and links to being able to see what's actually built on the platform are available on the website, so check it out. Fact number 3 is that, okay, so in terms of comparing, I got my notes here, in terms of comparing apples to apples again, EOS is targeting kind of a different niche of consumer, so to speak. So if one's kind of a red apple, the other is kind of a green apple. And in this case, EOS is targeting more of large businesses and people that want to have a faster and cheaper blockchain experience, which is the majority of people. But it brings me to point number 4. It's at the sacrifice of security in a lot of ways, because EOS is designed to be a decentralized platform, just like Ethereum is, just like a lot of blockchains are. That's like the beauty of blockchain and running nodes for it, is the fact that validating the network and making sure all the transactions are going through the way they're supposed to, and all the transactions are valid, and everything happening in the network is honest. That ideally and optimally, and what Bitcoin, like the philosophies that Bitcoin was built on, the best way to do that is when everything is as decentralized and quote unquote trustless as possible. But EOS has much more of a centralized and trusted network, which again, that's where you sacrifice the security, because doing that, having much fewer nodes running and supporting the network, much fewer more readily identified nodes that can identify each other and potentially collude and falsify records on the blockchain, that's where you run into issues. Is when you have, in this case, there's only 21. There's 21 nodes that are elected. They're the quote-unquote delegate nodes that get to validate the network. And again, if there's only 21, then it's much easier, and they're more publicly known because they've been voted on, then it's much easier for those 21 or 11 of those 21, a majority of those 21 nodes, to be able to come together and collude and say, hey, let's falsify records on this blockchain in our favor. And that's where you run into security issues. So yes, it's faster because you don't have as many nodes competing to mine the next block. And I'll get into why it's cheaper a little bit later, but at the same time, you're sacrificing the security of the network, because instead of being set up like a network like Bitcoin, like a network like Ethereum, like a network like a lot of these blockchain applications are, or blockchain platforms are, instead of being set up to run hundreds, if not thousands, if not in an ideal and dreamy world, millions of full nodes all around the world that don't know each other, that are supporting the network. Instead of doing that and being able to rely on the fact that the odds of those like giant number of nodes colluding are really, really low, instead of doing that, EOS only has 21, which again, you get a much faster network, but you're really sacrificing potentials for security. And on a kind of side note, one of the things that Dan Larimer, the founder, had cited in the fact that like, oh, one of the security mechanisms they have in place is that every time one of the validating nodes goes to sign the block that is up for approval, up for mining, so to speak. Every time a node goes or a miner goes to do that, then they're signing a copy of the Constitution every time to try and keep them more honest. And I'm like, okay, let's be real. In a world where there's enough money at stake potentially, enough value at stake potentially, there's going to be incentives for a lot of dishonest nodes. Of those 21, there's going to be a lot of incentives that outweigh dishonest incentives that outweigh their fidelity to that constitution that they're signing when they create a block. But anyways, I digress. So let me stick to the script a little more. So that brings me to point number 5, which is that EOS has what's considered a delegated proof of stake model of consensus. And what that means is that proof of stake is what Ethereum's moving towards. It's a very, very popular form of consensus within the blockchain world. And it's usually where a person, a miner, let's say you want to be a staker, you can put forth so much EOS, so much Ethereum, so much of, whatever the native cryptocurrency is into some sort of like an escrow account, almost like collateral. So that way, if it is your turn to mine a block, then you have that certain amount of EOS or certain amount of Ethereum at stake. That's your holdings, that's your value that you don't want to be chipped away at or penalized if you falsify a transaction or if you submit an invalid block. And so that's what EOS does. But unlike Ethereum's model of proof of stake that they're trying to move towards, where anybody and everybody that has enough hardware and software to run a full node and has enough stake, enough ether in the system, like I think it's, there's been talks of 12, there's been talks of like 6, there's, like if you have that certain amount of stipulated ether or stake to put forth to be a miner, to validate the next block, and you have the hardware or software to run the program accordingly, then anybody that can do that can be a staker. And that's Ethereum's, that's a more traditional model of proof of stake. Whereas proof of stake in the EOS world, it's delegated proof of stake. You're electing those delegates to validate the network. And there's only 21 of them. So not anybody with the right hardware or software can participate, and amount of stake can participate. It's only those 21 delegates. Which again, makes the network a lot faster because there's not a lot of contention in the network in terms of finding the next block. But you're only relying on 21. Much more opportunity for collusion. So in case I haven't driven that point home enough, let's talk about point number, I think it's like 6 at this point. Point number 6, which is the fact that those 21 delegate nodes are elected by the highest EOS stakeholders, which is a practice that I am kind of questioning of, because that would be, I'm trying to relate to it, and I think the best way to relate to it is if you are in the United States, that would be like allowing the wealthiest holders, like the holders of the most US dollars, the wealthiest people, maybe the top 1% if you want to be bougie about it, that would be like allowing them to elect the 21 people or 21 institutions in charge of maintaining the dollars in the system and how those dollars are flowing and the ledger that tracks those dollars. So you would pretty much be allowing the wealthiest people in the country, in the ecosystem, to elect the delegates, 21 delegates that get to decide how the money supply and is flowing and being recorded. So obviously that could raise some issues because that's not terribly different from the system that we have now in terms of how influence actually flows. So I feel like, just trying to picture what's going on in the EOS ecosystem, there's probably a few really wealthy EOS holders, like people who hold a high amount of EOS, that have certain friends or institutions that want to be delegates that say, hey, I have this amount of EOS, therefore I have this amount of voting rights in the system, like a large amount of voting rights in the system, and you're my buddy, so I'm going to vote and elect you as a delegate to mine, and maybe you can pay me back in some favors. Again, when you concentrate so much power with such few people, there's more opportunities for collusion and therefore untrustworthy, unsavory activity to happen in their favor because they can collude to do it. Anyways, also within the point number 6 is the fact that the highest EOS holders in the network also get the most bandwidth in the network. And this brings us back to point number 2, which was the niche, what do you say, tomato, that EOS tries to fill, which is catering to more large scale blockchain users. So larger companies that have a lot more money to spend, have a lot more EOS at their disposal, can buy a lot more bandwidth within the network and be able to scale their applications a lot better within the network, which is great for them, but that kind of stinks for maybe a small business or individual who decided to build a decentralized application, a dApp, on the network, and their decentralized application is not able to run as quickly, or their contracts aren't processed as quickly because they don't hold as much EOS to be able to facilitate a faster transaction. So in one way it makes sense, but again, in another way, if I'm a small fish, I'm not going to necessarily want to build on that network. So, but again, that they might not be catering to small fish as much, is my point as well. So let's move on to point number 7, which is the fees. Yeah, let me read this for a second. So EOS helps keep their fees lower by paying their miners, their node delegates, the same amount of EOS for every block that is validated, regardless of the fees that are paid within the block. So a good way to compare this is in the Bitcoin network. A problem that a lot of people cite is the fact that, it's good if you're a miner. Let's go from the point of view of a miner. If you're a miner in the Bitcoin network and you're looking at your mempool, your pool of transactions to possibly put into your next block, load into your next block to validate in your next block, you have incentive to pick the transactions with the highest amount of fees attached to it, because in addition to your block reward, your 12.5 Bitcoin that you're going to get if you mine the next block, you will also get the fees, all of the different fees that were attached to the transactions that you're processing. That's that additional incentive. So obviously, if you're a miner in the Bitcoin network, you have more incentive to add in transactions that have higher fees attached to them, like, an $8 fee to process a transaction versus a 50-cent fee to process a transaction. So this makes the Bitcoin network typically more expensive for end users, because if you're a user and you want your Bitcoin transaction to be processed relatively quickly, you're going to pay a premium in fees to do that in order to incentivize the miners to push that transaction through. But in the EOS network, the way they keep fees lower for users, for end users, is that they say, hey, whatever one of these 21 delegate nodes is currently mining the next block, they're only going to get paid the same amount of EOS regardless of the fees that are in it. So there's no incentive to add high fees to your transactions, because it's not going to incentivize the miners to process your transaction, those 21 node delegates to process your transaction any faster. So that's kind of nice. I do like that about EOS so far. But I haven't personally seen it in action. If you have any experience with EOS that you're like, hey, maybe they say this and that's where I'm getting my information from, but I've actually used this part of EOS and here's what my experience actually was, I would love to know, so please feel free to engage. Let's go on to number 8. Number 8 is the fact that the EOS platform allows for RAM trading, or random access memory trading. So this free market approach helps efficiently allocate resources, and the EOS system contract, so it allows users to buy RAM from the platform and sell RAM back to the platform in exchange for EOS. So in other words, if you are sitting around and you're like, hey, I've got this extra computing power and I would love to make some cash for it, some EOS for it, you can go ahead and do that by selling your memory, your computer memory, to the network. Again, process-wise, I would love to see what this looks like. So if you have like a flow chart of how that actually works from like system to system and how those peers are actually able to share memory. Like, I'm not a computer scientist, but I would love to know how that works. Anyways, but again, if you're sitting at home and you're like, hey, I have all this extra memory I would love to share to the network and make some money for it, you can do that and earn EOS by supposedly selling some of your RAM. And conversely, if you're a large business and you're like, hey, I got a lot of traffic happening right now and I need a lot more memory in order to support what's going on with my decentralized application, you can buy extra EOS, have a lot of extra EOS, and go and spend that EOS on extra RAM to support your application to run smoother on the network. Last 2 points. My eyes are tired. The first one, or 9, the 9th one, I guess, so to speak, is the fact that EOS allows their smart contracts to be programmed in the C++ programming language, which is a lot more known in the computer science world. So there's one fewer barrier to entry for somebody who already knows a decent amount of about computers to come in and program and develop on the EOS network. That's really nice, because conversely, Ethereum, the other Apple, in order to program well, run decentralized applications and smart contracts, like write smart contracts in the Ethereum network, on the Ethereum network, in the Ethereum ecosystem, you have to know a native computer programming language called Solidity that they built. So I don't think Solidity is terribly difficult for people who already know a decent amount about computer languages, but it is an extra step that you have to go through in order to really actively participate in the Ethereum network versus the EOS network, whereas if you already know C++, which again is a lot more common and readily known, then you can easily go in and start to write smart contracts and build decentralized applications. So that's kind of cool. Last, and kind of the least point in terms of impact, is the fact that on the EOS network, you are able to choose a 12-character username instead of having to use that like long gobbledygook of address. So in other words, if you wanted to send me EOS, instead of having to copy and paste that long string of random letters and numbers, or God forbid, type in that long random string of letters or numbers, instead, I could give you my EOS username of at least 12 characters, and then you can just send funds and EOS to that address, which is a lot nicer for people. It's more relatable. It's definitely one of those points about like the user experience, user interface, that's probably a lot nicer for people to actually send funds to, because you don't have to be intimidated, especially if it's a new user. You don't have to be like, what the heck is this address? So that's kind of cool. But anyways, that wraps up the 10 facts about EOS that I learned while doing lots of research on it. And again, if you want more info related to the research that I did, check out cryptkeepers.club, hover over CryptKeeper by Coin, and click on EOS. And there you will have lots more information, as well as links to even more information in case you want to take a trip down the EOS rabbit hole. And yeah, that's it. I will see you next time.